Did it work?
It worked.
It worked. Oh, I'm so happy. All right, thank you so much everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Julia Gavin, coming to you from Nashua, New Hampshire this evening. I'm one of the board members. I'll introduce my friends in just a few moments as well. Again, thank you for coming tonight. Here's our agenda. This evening, Cheryl Platz, principal designer and owner of Idea Platz, is joining us to discuss capturing customer context for an upside down world in the craziness that has been 2020 and 2021. We're really excited to see everything that she can share with us. And we'll have a couple minutes for upcoming events, job opportunities, or people who are looking. Cheryl's presentation will go about 6:50 to 7:30 for your timing, and then Q&A after that. And if you'd like to put any questions in the chat, then I'll be able to read them to Cheryl. If you want to say them yourselves, just give me a heads up, but I'll make sure to stop talking so I can make some space. And then we'll wrap up at about 7:50, 8 o'clock. And just a note that tonight's meeting will be recorded and put on YouTube because we've had so much interest for this. So if you want to remain more private, feel free to turn your camera off or change your name, whatever you have to do to feel more comfortable. And then if you want to drop your LinkedIn or portfolio links or anything in the chat, feel free to put them in at any point. I'll try to remember to put them over onto the Slack channel, but sometimes I don't quite remember that far. Any questions before I keep going? New Hampshire UXPA is a member of the National Association. Everyone is welcome to join, but not required to come to any of our meetings. And this is our contact information, the main website, more on Facebook, Twitter, Slack, and LinkedIn as well. Our board members for this year, if you want to wave or say hello, board member friends.
Hello.
Christine and Kyle have been working on this for several years, and then Kyle and I are new this year. Our upcoming events. Next month, we have Karen Van Houten, who is covering my information, who's going to present on how we got wicked good, which I'm really, really excited. I'm not sure if the title translates for everyone outside of New England, but this is a good thing, the wicked part. And then on Wednesday, May 26th, we have a special Lunch and Learn with Donna Litchow, who will be discussing owning your story as a leader. I'll drop some links to their information in the chat as well. And I'll put these links for upcoming events in the chat. Convey UX has really exciting online half day or so events coming up I think it's the first Thursday of every month, April to September. The Design Thinking Conference is April 13th to 14th. And then the BAD conference, I think that's the behavioral something design. I can't remember what it stands for, but that looks really interesting. I'll share the update in the chat. And then the Information Architecture Conference is coming up as well. Just a note on that the workshops begin April 19th, even though the conference itself starts the 28th. So there's time to tune in beforehand. UXPA's Boston UX Fair is going to be May 13th, and it's virtual. I think they just closed calls for the undergraduate and graduate papers, but they have some really good responses so far. So it's gonna be a fun time. And then they also just announced their conference for this year will be virtual again. It'll be September 24th. And the call for speakers will go out April 5th. It'll be great to see some New Hampshire representation there. And I'll include the contact for their conference chair, which will be conference@uxpa.org. We have some job opportunities. Easter Seals, this wasn't quite UX, but I figured if someone wanted to make a jump to nonprofit, they're hiring for a web manager in Manchester. EQ Engineered in Hampton Falls has a lot, 5 design leads, 4 senior UI designers, and 1 UX researcher. Fidelity has several up right now. The principal UX designer and the business architecture analyst looked most interesting. And then Flex also has a senior UI designer and a human factors engineer. Is there anyone else that would like to share job opportunities or that they are looking for a job? I don't know how to look at everyone when I'm sharing my screen. just chime in if you want to share anything or. Okay, I'm going to move on, but there will be time. Oh, Dan, go ahead.
Thanks. My name is Dan Zollman. I am just jumping into freelancing and consulting in UX after about a decade working in mostly in enterprise environments. And I'm focusing on UX strategy, research, information architecture, and facilitating and leading the design process in general. I'll drop my LinkedIn URL into the chat, but feel free to reach out if you have any projects coming up, or even if you need to temporarily backfill a spot. Just looking to for anything to get me started. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Dan. And we'll have some time at the end as well. And then a big shout out thank you to our sponsor, Market Street Talent. Jay, are you still here? Just want to say anything?
I'm here. Yeah, hi everybody. I've met a bunch of you. I'm looking forward to possibly later this year or next year shaking hands again. I hope someday we can all meet in a nice place with pizza and drink. For those of you I haven't met yet, Market Street Talent is located right in downtown Portsmouth. We're a full staffing firm and recruiting outfit, both consultant-based and permanent. We have several opportunities that are open in that same UI, UX, and design space. Throughout the year, we get them all the time. So people that haven't connected with us, we've actually placed several of the UXPA members, both in the Boston and the New Hampshire chapter. So keep the resumes coming. And if those of you who maybe aren't looking, but just want to have a conversation about the job market, interview tactics, techniques, resume building, all of that's a free service that we provide, and most agencies will, but we'll go a little bit further for anybody that wants to learn, or anybody wants to know about what's going on, or needs help with anything really. So thanks a lot for letting us sponsor, and thanks a bunch for giving me a platform to speak.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay.
You're welcome.
And Cheryl, thank you again for coming this evening to discuss all your exciting work right now. And I want to say congratulations on your book coming out pretty recently, Design Beyond Devices, Creating Multimodal Cross-Device Experiences. I'll drop a link to that as well in the chat. And I think I could stop sharing my screen now. If I could get my cursor to show up.
And I'll start sharing mine.
Stop sharing. Thank you. That's a lot of pressure to be sharing your screen like that.
Well, you're off the hook now.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Cheryl.
Well, thank you for the welcome, Julia, and hello, everybody. I am joining you from the currently sunny state of Washington on the far coast. And as far as, since today's topic is customer context, I want to thank you for joining me on the rescheduled date of the talk, because my context changed on the 21st of March when I got rushed to the hospital for emergency appendectomy surgery. So yeah, and as far as context is concerned, if you see my face do a weird thing, I'm probably reacting to unwanted pain signals. So just ignore that. It's not like haven't suddenly decided that I hate design, just hate that. So that's my context for the day, but I'm glad you're here with me, and happy to be talking to you today about one of the many topics I am passionate about, which is the importance of context, particularly, when I started writing the book, this was the first topic I started writing about. My book, Design Beyond Devices, is kind of about breaking us out of the one-to-one relationship between like our computer and ourselves, because so much is cross-device or is multimodal these days. But in my experience, you can't design a good, expansive experience without fully understanding what surrounds your customers. And that was true in 2019 when I started writing the book. And it's super true now that everything has changed since March 2020. Everything is crazy and different. So I'm going to talk to you about a framework I proposed that helps you dig deeper into what surrounds your customers and hopefully help you build a better base for your more expansive design work if you get there. And even if you think you're not at the cutting edge of design, if you're working on a site that crosses both desktop and mobile, this context matters. So a couple things up front, Black Lives Matter, especially at this time while a lot of folks are dealing with the trauma of the Derek Chauvin trial. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. And this talk is being delivered within the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples of the Duwamish tribe here. And despite hundreds of years of broken treaties and setbacks, the Duwamish people continue to shine a light here in their ancestral lands as the host tribe of Seattle, all while continuing to petition for formal government recognition. So I'm grateful to the Duwamish tribe, past and present, and honor their land itself. It's a pretty great place. So we are on our way to where no interface has gone before. And when I describe my book to people who are maybe outside the industry, I say like, well, I hope that it's a design manual for people who want to design experiences like the Bridge of the Starship Enterprise, where you move from physical controls to touch panels to holograms to speaking to the computer, and you do that all seamlessly. But there's so much that has to go into the back end to make those seamless transitions possible, and a lot of it depends on context. A lot of it depends on what the crew member needs in the moment, where they're standing, what they're doing, where their hands are positioned, where their gaze is, what part of the ship they're on, maybe even what their rank is. And we as designers are designing products at the final frontier of design right now. And our customers have 5 senses and this small universe of devices. And still, many of our stakeholders are obsessed with like a mobile device or a PC. And it's hard a lot of times to make the case to even like connect those things in a really holistic manner, or to not to mention like including like a smart speaker or a smart TV or something else as part of that broader experience. And so part of why we're not designing for all of them is because it's hard to make that case to our stakeholders that those extra experiences might have value, might be important to our customers. Now, the website has been declared dead many times already, many, many times. Like, oh, this is the end of the website. We're moving to VR. Smart speakers are going to kill websites. And it still thrives. It's still there. We're all still using it. You signed up for this probably on a desktop computer, probably, maybe mobile, but Eventbrite is not great on mobile. But it lives on many devices and via many modes of interaction. Just take Wikipedia. It's accessible via desktop or mobile, but also smart speakers to the point where they're going to charge for access to their API via smart speakers. And let's take those prognosticators for a second. Let's say that the website is dying. Like, where would we go next? Like, is it mobile first? Is it all apps? Like Forbes breathlessly told us in 2016, like 10 ways to win the mobile first revolution. Mobile first. And then a year later, Nielsen Norman's telling us, no, it's voice first now. It's not mobile first, it's voice first now. Those are very different things. And as a designer, you'd be forgiven for going to a doctor for whiplash when trying to deal with that change over the course of like a year. And the thing is, our natural instinct to seek a winner is missing the point. There is no one true interface. And most of the devices your customers are using are multimodal, like voice first, touch first, whatever. Your phone does all of those things. And you can say an interface is voice first, but to customers who can't use voice interaction, voice first is useless. There's no one true path for interaction. The future is multimodal because humans are multimodal. Now, when I talk about my book title, which is creating multimodal cross-device experiences, people are like, okay, I get the cross-device thing, but what the heck is multimodality? I don't know. So in this context, and the word mode is ironically multimodal, the word mode in this context is a type of communication, and humans typically communicate using their senses. Or at least they take in communication using their senses. We don't put out communication using our senses. And a multimodal interaction is an exchange between a device and a human being, or two human beings, but in this case, a device and a human being, where multiple input or output modalities can be used simultaneously or sequentially, depending on context and preference. So if you are looking at my slides and you are listening to me speak, that's multimodal output. You are taking in written words and you are listening to the spoken words. And so you're actually taking in two forms of input at once. If you were to speak to me to give me questions and then send an image, you're technically interacting with me in two different modalities and sending me multimodal input. So we'd be having a multimodal interaction right there through Zoom. So that, we're not actually looking too far in the future. It's something that we can do very easily, even in the tool we're in now. Just not always easy to do in the tools that we're in now, despite the fact that many of our tools support them. And Zoom does not natively support voice interaction, so that's not a thing we can do here. But that doesn't mean we can't do multimodal interaction already. So multimodal experiences incorporate classic interactions like screens and keyboards and mouse and touch with newer tech, often like voice, gestures, lights, and sensors. There's a difference between tapping to touch and then like our sort of pinch and zoom and our multi-fingered, like all of those gestural interactions that add a layer onto our smartphone interactions, for example. Those are technically a little bit different than just touch itself. We'll talk about that on this next slide. So in my book, I call out 5 different communication modalities. And as we look into investigating our customers' context, figuring out what the most convenient or desirable ways for customers to communicate is, we want to understand this baseline first. And so these 5 communication modalities, they don't directly line up with senses because we're taking in some of them hit multiple of these hit visual senses, for example, multiple hit physical senses. We aren't leaning too heavily into touch and smell, or to taste and smell, because that's like a whole other ball of wax. So visual, we can all take that for granted. Many of us can take that for granted. Some folks have visual disabilities and cannot take that for granted, but any stimulus is going to be interpreted over optical channels, typically static. And the other form of communication that can be interpreted over visual channels is sometimes kinetic communication. Like an animated GIF is kind of both visual and kinetic, like if there's a message in the communication. We have auditory communication, so things that are communicated via sound. I am communicating to you over the auditory channel by speaking right now, and by the visual channel by showing you these slides. Haptic communication is using physical force or the physical environment. So if you have an Xbox controller with a rumble feature, then you are inherently getting haptic feedback. So that, for some reason, I can't get the chat window to move over here. I just want to, well, I can't see chats. We'll just look at that later. So that haptic communication, that's pretty much one of the canonical things. Your phone vibrating to tell you something, that's haptic feedback. Direct manipulation, when I click on my mouse, that is haptic feedback into the haptic input into the computer. Typing on my keyboard, that's haptic input. I'm physically manipulating the environment. Kinetic output from a system is pretty self-explanatory, like the moving of a pendulum on a grandfather clock. But kinetic input's more interesting because like clicking on a mouse is haptic, but if the information's in the movement, like I'm drawing and the information is the path, then it's more kinetic. It's like the movement is the message. And then of course we have devices like the Xbox Kinect, where again, the movement is the message. We're swiping with our bodies, or we're using gestures on our phone. That's kinetic communication. It's not about the destination, it's the journey. And then we have the ambient category, which, this one's a little bit up for subjective, but this category for me is inferred meaning driven by environmental or biometric conditions. So it's not direct interaction with the device. It's elsewhere, like and that can be, as far as output is concerned, like maybe there's a smell, like it doesn't you can't tell where a smell is coming from. It could be from the device, but your body's not going to really be able to tell the source. Temperature, again, like in rare cases, you can tell specifically where a temperature is coming from, but a lot of times it's just like the room is cold. And then ambient input's really interesting because, you know, it's things like heart rate or presence. Sort of by nature of our existence, we give information to the computer or the device, and it takes action potentially based on intent we expressed in some other way at some other time. Like the Nest, you're like, okay, when I come home, turn the heat up. When you come home and the heat goes up, that's an ambient interaction. Like you didn't tell it to put the heat up in the moment. You showed up and the heat went up. There was a more traditional haptic interaction earlier. You did the thing, it stored that intent, and now I show up and it gets hotter. So, and because I can't seem to get the chat stuff show up, we will answer questions at the end. So feel free to type them in chat and we'll scroll through, or we will do the hands at the end. But dimensions driving multimodality. So it turns out, so there's all these different things, you know, there's all these different outputs and inputs. Like, how do you decide what's good or what you need or what you want to use? And it turns out that there's like two things you need to know to start to make an informed decision. And the reason we're covering this before we really talk about the techniques for getting deeper customer context is you kind of want to know what information you want before going and asking some of those questions. And the two dimensions that matter, a lot of dimensions matter, but these two can really have a really direct influence on how you choose to position your experience. One of them is how rich is your information? You know, on one side, you have low information density, like a smartwatch or wearables. So like, is your customer just asking for, you know, a temperature or, you know, a yes or no question? That opens up a lot of interesting opportunities. Whereas a high density information like a book or a spreadsheet, you're probably not going to want to communicate that information over certain channels. Like you're certainly not going to be able to use the pendulum of a grandfather clock. And even doing that over speech is going to require a very sensitive touch. And so understanding how rich the information the customer wants will really have a direct influence on how what you want to do, where you want to go with your multimodality, your choices. And then on the other dimension, you have how close is the device going to be to the customer? Or conversely, like what devices does the customer keep near them? You know, what's in close proximity to them on a regular basis? Their phone usually, not always. You know, are there watches or other wearables near them versus devices that are at long range, your TVs, your smart speakers, etc. Understanding what your customer has at close and long range can also influence what choices you're going to make in the long term and what choices they're going to make. Like if they have a bunch of devices near them and there's one right in front of them, you could make a really great voice experience, but they may just choose the phone because it's easier. So understanding that context and how people use things can save you money too. And once you have the answers to those two questions, you can take a look at the spectrum of multimodality. There's two axes here. You know, on the horizontal axis, we have the proximity, and on the vertical axis, we have the information density. And by kind of roughly placing yourself in one of these quadrants, you can find an interaction model, which is a really good place for you to start when thinking about what model may be best for your customers. So, you know, each of these quadrants brings a different philosophy. Not all multimodal experiences are created the same. So if I know that my customer is going to be near an experience like that brings a lot of richness to the table, like a smart TV, or this always happens. She always triggers like a smart TV or something like that, or even a desktop computer. What you're looking for is you have customers may choose that if they're looking for rich information, and you know they're going to have to be in close proximity most of the time. They're probably, especially if it's a computer, like the input devices, they're just not going to interact with the computer far away. So you end up with going into the quadrant number 2, anchored experiences. And so you can make certain assumptions about like what's near them, what kind of, Are they going to have physical input devices near them? Probably, because they're in one place. It might be a keyboard and mouse, it might be a remote, but they'll probably have some kind of physical input device. It's probably going to be a controlled space, so you can make some assumptions about their ability to control sound and things like that. Versus I might have somebody who is walking all around all over the place, and their hands are busy. And they're often asking just quick questions. They just need answers to things. They need help. Or the traditional, like, hey, this person has a big kitchen and they need help while they're preparing meals. That puts us in quadrant 4, intangible experiences, where I am not necessarily going to be near the device. I'm okay with getting little snippets of information, like, what the conversion of teaspoons to tablespoons or something like that. That's easily transmitted over a voice channel. And we don't need a TV screen to transmit that information. Direct interactions, where we're close and it's scoped information, customers are probably going to choose that when they're on the go and no other devices are available to them. And then we have the adaptive quadrant, which is kind of the holy grail for inclusivity, which devices that support both close proximity and long range interactions and can handle both low scope, both rich and scoped information. The closest we have right now are things like the Echo Show and the Google Nest Hub, or whatever it is named this week, but they're not fully adaptive. For the Echo Show, for example, it doesn't let me start with touch. I have to start with voice, and then I can use touch to kind of finish the interactions. So it adapts in that way. Like if I'm in the kitchen, like I can use touch to follow through and get some more detail. But a fully adaptive experience includes the most people possible, because whatever my conditions are, temporary disability, permanent disability, just preference, I can choose what's right for me. But it's the most expensive and complicated model. You're essentially developing both anchored and intangible experiences, like you're developing all of those things. So, but this is, I talk about this more in chapter 7 of my book, but about the nature of each of the sort of interaction models in these quadrants. But once you understand more about like your customer's context, you understand more about what they're likely to choose, and you can start to make decisions about how to position your experience. The way we wrote prompts for the Fire TV was very different than the way we wrote prompts for just random Alexa text, because wandering around the house is different than looking at a screen. We were less verbal when we knew they were going to be looking at a screen anyway. You must understand your customer's context to understand what makes sense in the moment. Context matters. So just to refresh our brains, like the anchored experience, there's extra content there. We don't need to necessarily read everything out over the voice channel.
I'm sorry.
Stop it. So we don't need to necessarily repeat everything on the voice channel. We can assume that people will be able to see more things most of the time. Adaptive works really well in the kitchen, where sometimes people are going to need to dip in. Sometimes their hands are going to be dirty. Direct, there's some experiences where only direct will work. If you're running, you're not going to do anchored. You're not, and even intangible's tough too, because sometimes it's noisy or there's wind or something like that. And then intangible experiences work for certain types of information. So what kinds of information are people asking for? And who else is around? Do you trust the people who are around when you're having those conversations? And most of our assumptions about the context people have and the way the world works have changed since March 2020. Office environments, different. Education, the way that works, different. Public transportation, people aren't taking it. Travel and like commutes in general, not the same. Family gatherings, is that allowed? There's so many things that have changed that it's a really great time to be in user research. And I've seen the job listings pick up a lot for user research because we're back to ground on a lot of these things. So it's a good time to like expand our technique and get more context as long as we're there so that we can ask these broader questions. Now you'll note I didn't mention smartphones at all in the spectrum of multimodality, and that's because they can pretty much do anything, and it depends on the kind of content you're presenting, because they're with your customer all the time. Some people are going to set them up and actually watch them as if they're an anchored experience, or they'll like plug in keyboards. Like you can, they're super wild cards. So, you know, for productivity experiences, I contend that they belong in the direct quadrant. Short range with a constrained screen when compared to full laptop screens. If you ever looked at the Google Sheet on a phone, that is a constrained experience. It's not ideal. It's basically like looking at something through a toilet paper tube. It's not great. Versus an optimized experience like gaming on mobile, that really feels more anchored. You know, the device is close to you. It feels rich. It feels responsive. And then you have voice-enabled apps like Alexa push into adaptive, where you can like do stuff by touch, or you can just open up the voice app and tell it what you want and have it respond. So the phone is a super wild card. And then you can even do Intangible if you've turned on the, I'm not going to say, but like, you know, the OK Google response for your phone. You can be far away and have it respond. So the other subtitle of my book, Cross-Device Interactions. Transitions are tricky. We've all been trained to specialize in like a specific type of interface. That might be voice, it might be websites, it might be mobile. And what we aren't encouraged to think about is the going between those things. And often it's the thing that comes up at the last minute, or like a service designer comes in and is like, what is happening? And so another part of getting our context is to tell the story about why transitions are going to occur in our customers' lives, to make that case more prominent, and to get the time and the investment to spend time working on those transitions, because it's important. Like I have a whole chapter in my book about transitions, because it's like a whole thing now. I wouldn't say you need a whole designer for transitions, but it definitely needs to be a track. And, you know, just off the top of my head, there's a ton of reasons why people would need to transition between devices. Commuting, if that ever becomes a thing again, traveling. And I mean, some people are commuting now. I've been stuck in this house for 13 months, so it's salty. Meal times, exercise, or just the daytime, nighttime shift, or like the sun moves and you can't take your phone call on this device anymore because you look like you're a ghost. There's all kinds of reasons why you might need to transition between devices, just because of environmental conditions. And then there's device suitability. And this is a very personal decision for people. They have preferences, like where do they like consuming data versus data entry. At the Gates Foundation, where I do my full-time work, people really like consuming things on tablets. And that, like, there was just this emergent use case where people are just getting tablets to do data consumption, even though they had laptops they liked. It was just this preference thing. So without getting the context, you wouldn't understand why iPads just kept showing up on the network. Physical comfort. Yes, I am disabled, and there's just could be times where one device does not work for me. Temporary interference, multitasking, all of these things may encourage somebody to go between devices and make those transitions important. So now we've kind of done our baseline work and talked about like the reasons why we're looking for extra context. And now we can talk about the how, like how we look for extra context, how we expand our existing research questions and techniques to go a little bit deeper. And I like to use, I propose in my book in chapter 2, using a framework we use at my improv theater. So in my free time, I am a professional improviser and teacher with Unexpected Productions in the Pike Place Market in Seattle. Fun fact, it's the reason the gum wall exists, which is another thing that's weird in a new context in the middle of a pandemic that we'll have to work out. But so we, you know, when people are paying to see you perform and you're making things up, you want to make compelling scenes quickly. And so we have this shorthand for what makes a compelling scene that the human brain will believe, that will fill in the gaps. And we use this acronym CROW. It's a storytelling shorthand, and it stands for character, relationship, objective, and where. We try to establish these components as quickly as possible in a scene so that we can, because that's what helps our audience our customers believe us and believe the same. And this same model can be applied to the questions we should be asking our customers to build a well-rounded story about what's going on in their lives. And so let's dive deeply on each of these different aspects. So for character, the questions we're asking are about what defines your customer. And you've probably done a screener. So you have these rough, sort of categories that got them into the study in the first place. But there's a lot more. And I think this is particularly important in the context of what we're going through right now, racial identity and discrimination and things. Like, it's important to dig more into like who someone is. Like, we can't be racially blind anymore. We can't be identity group blind anymore because the consequences of excluding people are too large. And so the character beat here challenges us to really understand the customer as an individual more than we might have before, as sensitively as we can. So, and when I teach improv from a book, I worked with, one of the books I drew from was a book called the Improv Handbook. It's very well titled, good branding. And it divided character into these three components that I like: attributes, attitudes, and choices. So when we're digging into the attributes of a person, it's the fundamentals, the things that don't change frequently. They sometimes change, like pronoun may change over time, but it doesn't change frequently. It's a fundamental attribute of a person. Just like gender identity might change infrequently, but is generally a fundamental aspect of a person's identity. Other things like mannerisms and habits, communities, cultures, disabilities, those are all attributes of a person. And so questions like, how does your customer define their own identity to themselves and others? Like, can you ask them to share what they're comfortable sharing with the public, or like how they would describe their identity to like their boss or to someone they were just becoming friends with, to figure out what groups they identify with. And so you can figure out how intersectionality might be affecting them when using your product, and which of their attributes might be underrepresented and how that's affecting the systems you're working within. Attitudes are emotions and reactions to outside stimuli. So this one, this is where culture comes to bear a lot. And, a question would be like, are there any preconceived opinions or learned behaviors that this person is going to bring to bear on this experience? There's a generation of people who have learned to work with this style of meetings and Zoom and Teams and whatever, will bring that experience to bear on whatever the next, like holographic meetings or whatever, I guess the thing that Microsoft's pushing now. But there may be other things like cultural preconceived notions that we need to take into consideration that will impact customer success. And then choices are the actions you take based on the beliefs and attitudes. So, things, it can be as basic as like, why would a customer choose to seek out your experience or not? Did they have a choice? And that's important with power dynamics and things like, is this been chosen for them? And there can be a lot of other important, we'll get into this a bit with some of the other elements too, but sometimes the choice is directly tied to their expression of their identity, which is a really important thing to figure out. Because if they associate your product with their identity and you change something about it that they thought was part of their identity, they're going to get mad. And it's good to be aware of those things up front. So the R in CROW refers to relationships. And so the question is, what connects your customer? And, there's the important thing to remember here is the closer you are to someone or something, the more likely you are to get emotional about it. Relationships drive satisfaction and frustration. So there's three types of relationships, I call it in the book. One of them is human to device, and we're pretty pro at this. Like but some things to consider, like who do they own the device they're interacting with? Like, is it work or them? Have they anthropomorphized the device? Have they named it? Are they emotionally connected to it? And is it some form of self-expression? Like a phone kind of is. That's going to influence the way they react to problems with the experience. Human to business relationships. This is one that I think comes very naturally to people who've been working in an enterprise context, but still important to ask, like, how are they interacting with your business? What were the choices they made? What's the competition? And what expectations did they bring when it came to your product? And then a big one is human to human relationships, which is easy to forget because we've spent so long talking about the one-to-one relationship. But when you talk about intangible experiences, so often the complicating factor there is there's multiple people in the room. They can talk and throw off the interaction. There's new things like people are embarrassed to talk, or they're like trying to get bank information and their family's there, or like the voice purchasing thing. And that, or even just on a desktop, are there multiple people using this machine? Are they using the same login? So is it like sequential use of the same login? Are people using different login accounts, but like one person's use affects the other one? Are people cooperatively using a single resource? Do you trust the people who are around you? Like there's cooperative use of Alexa, right? Like people will like all take turns and chime in, but it doesn't always work out super well because they're not really engineered for that. How has identity being managed? And is there a sense of competition at all? Like competition for resources, competition for performance? That human to human thing can be a big one. Objective is the O in CROW. And for this one, it's what drives your customer. Now, I hope that this one is pretty instinctive for the folks in this room, user experience professionals. And I hope that this one just brings as a reminder. But what have you defined as your customer's objective? And, is that truly their end goal, or just like a sentence written to get our customer to a feature? Like often when we come into a project and we've been called in and we weren't at the beginning, the use case is not actually a human readable goal. It's just like, I want to get to browse. No one wants to, unless it's like Netflix. There's some folks who like browsing Netflix for funsies. But if I'm working on a server software app, I don't browse for fun. I'm browsing to find the virtual machine that stopped so I can fix it. So like what is the customer's actual objective? And not just short-term objectives, long-term objectives can be really important too. Like even just like trying not to get fired or trying not to rack up points on some arbitrary system for getting a disciplinary action. I love to ask, what's your goal for this year at your job is one of my opening interview questions, because it can really inform a lot of the choices people are making. And, even within, once you've resolved your product goal, is like, have you assumed your solution stands alone, or is that true? Or are you part of a much larger device agnostic human objective that might span multiple experiences? And it's okay if you're not solving the complete thing, but we got to understand that there's other systems we're interacting with. And understanding that human objective will give us the clues and the breadcrumbs to go find those other pieces that are kind of inputs and outputs for us. The big one for objective, and hopefully again, this is just like super reminder, I give this talk to, given this talk to some PMs as well, but don't obstruct the objective. Once you understand it, don't get in front of it. Like let people do the thing they're trying to do. Timing and context matter. Like this is from the Nielsen Norman site, one of their studies, but like, even if you're offering something of value later, even if you're like super sure, and this one, I'm pretty sure they weren't sure, you're obstructing value in the moment. I come to this site, I want to shop for things, and you show me this dialogue, and you ask me if I can keep a secret. I'm like, I did not come to your site to be a spy. I came to look at furniture. This has nothing to do with my objective. And secret sales, like there's no reward in that for me. I'm like, so maybe you'll give me some arbitrary amount of discount at some point in the future for the exchange of my, like, I'm just going to leave. This is weird spy site. Goodbye. It's so much more effective once you understand the objective to let the objective sit, like let them do that. And then you can do your upsells or do your extra stuff afterwards, once they're like in the glow of completion, once they've, you're going to get an emotional response if you get in the middle of the objective. So it's so important to understand that core. And then the last part of CROW, the W, is where. What surrounds your customer? Where will they be when they want to interact with you? Are they seated, standing, moving? What's in arm's reach? What devices are available? who else is going to be in those environments? Are there distractions? Will customers expect to be able to move between devices? And this is so important for hands-free experiences. And my experience working on things like Alexa was often that you'd propose something and people would be like, they can just do this on their phone. Like, yes, but they don't want to because their hands are full or because their phone is in another room or something. And so having this context based in user research is critical to getting the funding to do the project in the first place. But we, you know, I think the whole industry, we had gotten to a point where we felt like we could make certain assumptions about the way the wear worked. And now we really just need to dig in, both because of the pandemic and because that like the fundamentals of how people move through their spaces and who else is with them has such a big influence on their choices on that spectrum of multimodality. So I've put together a couple of resources for people who are interested in working with the CRO framework. So if you're going back to a physical place with a printer, I have a set of printed worksheets you can use where you can, and this is designed so you can run a workshop with your stakeholders so that you can walk everybody through this. So there's like this shared understanding and shared buy-in that the goal of this kind of workshop is to convince your stakeholders that they don't know everything about your customer like they think they do, in a friendly and like collaborative way. Like get everybody's knowledge out on the table and then deconstruct and then kind of craft a plan forward by identifying which questions you don't know the answer to. So this URL is for just the worksheets. But I've also, if you just go to the Idea Platz website and look at you can just go to my website and look at the site under About Us, look at the book website. This is linked, all this stuff is linked there. Or you can just go to DBD-Idea Platz. There's also a mural template for a workshop using this content, capturing customer context workshops. You can, with mural templates, you can just save them into your own environment and use them. And there's an interview guide with CRO-inspired questions if you want to take a look at how some of these might feed into your existing research infrastructure. And then, defining your platform real quickly, how do you decide what channels and multimodal interaction models are appropriate for your experience? You take the customer context objectives you just figured out. The devices your customer own will influence what choices they make and which which quadrants are viable. And the objectives are going to indicate like where they're going to make conscious choices to move. And then you can figure out where you want to position yourself. So, and I'll share out the slides for this, but there's some additional information. Some of this we've talked about earlier, but like Adaptive's most inclusive and expensive. Anchored is great when you've got a lot of information. Direct is really good for like repeatable, simple tasks. And Intangible is really good for like questions and search, but sucks in multi-user environments, at least in the current state of technology. And then some other things you're going to need to work out across like channel strategy, like cross devices, a device and transition strategy, how you're gonna and what's supported on each device, a proactivity strategy, like when do you need to bring information to your customer? And if you do, how are you going to interrupt them politely? That's a whole other like 3 chapters of my book. And then a user data strategy, because if you're moving between things, what user profile information is needed cross-platform to continue that experience. And so often that stuff gets embedded in the UI layer and people are like, we can't actually share the state. So having those conversations early and having a strategy about it is really important to make a successful set of transitions. And then when you're doing designs like this, multimodality, within a scenario, you want to document initiation of the scenario and key transitions. And then across all scenarios, you want to find the key moments where things can like be completed in more than one modality. And like examples of the key goals people are bringing to the system. And this is on top of the existing designs you're doing. You're still going to do visuals. You're still going to do voice if you got voice, but you want this extra layer of like how everything connects. So this is an example of a multimodal swim lane from my book where you're using a smartwatch with voice and touch to do an airport transfer, which was, when you went to an airport and you tried to get something to pick you up to take you to the hotel. So there's a couple of different paths through, and this is a, very simplified example, but And these images are also available from Flickr, because Rosenfeld Media does that. So you can go take a look at these as well. So the same system that powers a website today can be extended to power a whole bunch of multimodal experiences. So that's the book page. You can go catch the downloads there. And my book is available on Amazon and on the Rosenfeld Media website. And if you get this code, DBDUNI0321, you can get 20% off any Rosenfeld book until the end of April, so April 30th. DBDUNI0321. So the final frontier is waiting for you. And so let's talk about questions. I'm gonna close this so I can find chat. Where did chat go?
I love this. Thank you so much, Cheryl.
Sorry, but it went a bit long.
No, keep talking, please. I love this. Let's see. So if anyone has questions, you can start putting them in the chat. I'll start. That's the good part about helping out. I can ask my question first. Have you seen pushback from teams or stakeholders on going deeper in some of these areas?
Yeah,
I mean, what has the reception been overall? I'm just curious.
It's been interesting because, yes, there's been pushback. Sometimes people just feel like they know their customer already. You come in and you're like, well, we need to know these things, or I already know these things. They're like, no, I understand our customers. And there's this narrative gap you have to transcend. In the cases where I already have the data, or in cases where I don't have the data and I'm trying to justify like getting it somehow, storyboarding is a key tool for me, and trying to find a way to bridge that narrative gap and get my stakeholders to put themselves in the customer's shoes. And I make a lot of intentional choices when I do that storyboarding. I do a lot of abstraction to make it as easy as possible for the stakeholder project themselves into the story. Like for the Echo Look, which was Amazon's fashion camera with Alexa enabled, like I intentionally abstracted gender because even though most of our customers were female, all of our stakeholders were men. And since like, if I make a bunch of like ladies here, they're going to other themselves and they'll be like, that's someone else and I don't want to invest in that. Maybe not consciously, but I didn't want that to happen. So like just boiling it down to the contextual details we needed, like the room and the goals and what was surrounding people. So that has been a very valuable tool for me in making the case to invest in more research, making the case to take the research and apply it in some way. And there have been other things too, like doing edits of actual recordings that we've done and research and things like that to continue to tell the story. And then the other technique is kind of these shared understanding workshops. This like people think they know until we dump it out on a table and then push deeper with a couple of more questions, like with these prompts. And when we push with these prompts, and everybody starts thinking, people get ownership over the questions. Like, oh yeah, we don't know that. I really want to know that. And we can move forward.
That's great. Those are some really excellent strategies. Thank you.
Sure.
So Dan has a question. The next time I hear a business leader say, we need a chatbot, or we need to start working on voice stuff, what are some of your key talking points to help them qualify how or when these technologies should be used?
It's a good question. With great power comes great responsibility. And so chatbots, they are, and they're, to me, they're really very different use cases, even though you can overload a chatbot with voice interaction. But like smart speaker stuff is useful in cases where you have very quick, light, repetitive tasks or informational fun stuff to offer. For high productivity scenarios or anything that requires like trust and privacy, smart speakers are not it right now. Like your kids are running around and you're doing banking. Yeah. And there's also a bunch of problems around acoustic uniqueness and stuff, like even with smart homes, which are usually like a home run. There's this challenge where if you let people name stuff, there's no guarantee they'll name stuff in a way you can talk about it, which is why like with like apps like Sonos, like they give you like predetermined room names. That's not because they're lazy and can't implement text. It's because they don't they know if they let you type whatever you want, you're going to get poor performance. And so there's like anytime you're talking about like people entering free text and recalling stuff, voice starts to be not the best thing in our current technology. And with chatbots, you know, question and answer stuff is really good in both voice and chatbot. Self-service stuff is really good in chatbots. But you need to be willing to do a little bit more than the basics. Like there's just like raw chatbot where it's just one turn question and answer, and those really don't do well because people are going to ask questions in weird ways. They're going to ask follow-up questions. It's very common to do things like, what's the weather in Orlando? What about Chicago? And so so many chatbots are implemented in such a lazy way that it doesn't understand what about Chicago, like that minimum amount of context. In my experience, that's an extra like 10 lines of code to understand, like to maintain that level of context. But you have to be willing to put in that little extra bit of work to give people that context. And if you're doing something complex like form submission, like doing the Domino's pizza thing, should really look into using an existing framework that will give you the support to do out of order data entry. Because if you're doing a rigid thing, like now I want the pepperoni, like give me the topping 1, give me the topping 2, give me the address. That's not how people think. Sometimes they're going to come at you and they're going to blurt out, I need a topping cheese pizza to go to this address. And sometimes they're going to come at you and I need a pizza delivered to this address and here's the toppings. And that uncertainty of human language and communication is what makes a lot of chatbots suck. Because the minute you come at it with an unexpected ordering, everything falls apart. So for chatbots, as much as you can use existing frameworks that will give you flexibility, do that and do the basic work to support like follow-on conversation. And for voice, in chatbots, like questions and answers are good. Quick repetitive tasks can be good. Things where you need high trust interactions are not great for smart speakers right now.
Great, that was an excellent response. Kyle has a question. What is the best way to organize a research study for a multimodal experience?
Well, and it depends on what point you are in the cycle. So if you're like exploring whether you should do a multimodal experience, ethnographic research where you're not telling people what your idea is if you've got the budget, is super great. That was again like the approach we took for things like Windows Automotive, although they knew we were in a car, so they knew that, but they didn't necessarily know like who we were or what we were trying to, like what our ideas were or what our funding was. For the Echo Look, we went to people's homes and we just we were like, can you tell us how you make decisions about clothing? Can you show us where you store your clothing? Can you, and that gave us context about, you know, what's in their home, where are their devices? Do they have devices? What are their struggles? When, you know, when you're later in the process, I encourage you to be proactive about testing and pursue Wizard of Oz testing if you can. You know, because again, like this stuff can be expensive, and I don't want you to be the designer that's like hitched your wagon to an expensive multimodal concept that people didn't need. Like we don't want to be solving problems that people don't have. And a lot of times you can mock this stuff up. Like you can pretend you're a chatbot in a Slack channel and test whether or not a chatbot interaction works. When we tested the Echo Look, I was charged with verifying whether or not speech interaction was viable because it cost $6 million to get the mics into the devices. And so I had to put together the study that like challenged voice, basically, like made it so like we were likely not to choose voice. And so, but we didn't have it fully implemented, right? So I had like I built like an HTML website with like buttons. So ooh, that's a bad position. I could press the actions that people had spoken sort of behind my back. So I'd wait until they said the command that lined up, and then I would trigger the device to do the thing that it was supposed to do. And that's a Wizard of Oz scenario, right? Like we don't have working voice, but it feels like it's working to them. And we can have a discussion that's valid about like, hey, was that any better than using the phone? Does it like, is it creepy? Are you worried about privacy? Like what's your thing? You know, same thing with like Windows Automotive. We built out like a functional wooden like car, I don't know why I can't say cockpit, like a car cockpit, like with, and we had like foil on the steering wheel so we could measure hands off, time that the hands were off the steering wheel and stuff, like because we didn't want to have problems when we got to the car because that's super expensive. So we found less expensive ways to evaluate those experiences and iterate. So that's, I encourage you to like find the cheapest way you can to test those ideas and invalidate them. Like it's not validation testing. It's not setting up favorable conditions. It's like, let's, if there's a simpler way to do this, except when it's an accessibility concern, like as much as we can, we want to make sure that we are using these technologies to include as many people as possible. But like, you know, with the Echolook, you still could have used a screen reader to interact with our thing, even if we had just done an app. So it was like invalidate the speech, but everyone said they wouldn't buy it without speech. So we put speech in.
All right, I want to do one of those studies. It sounds so much fun. Intense, but so Adam has a question. When you were talking about customers' true objectives, do you factor in differing willingness to invest in that objective? For example, you probably wouldn't create an account, let alone download an app to buy a box of Bic pens. And he also says, congratulations on the book and nice to see you again. Adam Polanski.
Thank you very much for joining me again. And thank you for the kind words, Adam. And so that's a really interesting question. I think a little bit of that is gets to the C in character, like the attitudes and choices, like what are their beliefs about privacy and like beliefs about technology that would influence their choices and how that interacts with objective. And that's a really interesting question. I think it's definitely important to once we have the objective, we want to observe people's behavior around the objective. We want to see like whether or not we're getting in the way of that objective. And I think, you know, when I talk about obstructing the objective, that's really relevant to this particular question because logins and account creation are obstructing the objective to purchase, right? And you know, I've had some people reach out that they were like frustrated that they had to create an account on the Rosenfeld Media site to buy a book on that site. And I'm like, I understand. The reason they make you do that is because all of our books, like print books, come with ebooks. And so like you can always download the book from there. I understand that it's an obstruction, but at least there's like a goal. We could maybe communicate that reason better, but you know, there's that. Just because they have the objection to buy the objective to buy the pens doesn't mean that we're not obstructing it with our sign up or login or whatever. And totally valid question. There are way too many login obstructions.
Yeah, that's a challenge in itself. See, Kimberly, do you think that voice control can be used to access secure devices? What is there to keep unauthorized users from accessing the device? Think using an Echo Dot to remotely access a work computer that is running experiments in a lab.
It's a very interesting question. It depends on your tolerance. Like, so no system's foolproof. So part of it depends on like your tolerance for risk. You know, but like neither is a desktop computer, right? Like a password can be compromised. And so we do two-factor stuff sometimes, but then sometimes we don't. You can like turn off two-factor. There's a difference between, so there's a couple of technologies that relate to like voice detection. One of them is voice profiles, which are different than voice printing. So voice profiles kind of like relatively try to tell the difference apart between different people in a household. But, you know, like a bunch of high-pitched people could come in and my household would probably think they're all me. And, you know, a bunch of low-pitched people could probably come in and my household would think they're all my husband. Versus voice printing, which is a very specific kind of fingerprinting for the voice technology, which is more on the spy side of things. You don't see it a lot, that can be used as a biometric. So there's certainly that end of the spectrum. It's not built into consumer devices today, but if you were running a lab, you could pursue that kind of thing. We talked about it for Windows Automotive. We really wanted that as like a potential unlock scenario where you could voice print into your car with a key phrase and your voice. and you could also do voice profiles with some other secondary metric, like your phone is present and you have the passcode and it matches the voice profile. So you say the right passphrase and it's you and your phone's nearby. And that's like 3 factors, and then you open it up. So, you know, you can find other ways to make it part of a system and make that viable as well.
Great, thank you. Matt has a question. How do you think about whether it makes more sense to build out many discrete modality transitions throughout a customer journey versus directing customers towards fewer, more select transition points? Should it just be expected at every step in a journey?
Ooh, very interesting question. It could almost be like a religious debate that no one's having yet, because like no one's even really thinking about these transitions. I think some choice is better than no choice. So like if we're like saying you have to choose one modality and that's it, or you're like, there are some places where we'll allow people to switch back and forth, especially if you have a good customer justification for the moving back and forth. Like the moving back and forth is good. Infinite transitions, I'm willing, like I'm a pragmatist, right? And so like infinite transitions like Star Trek, like, yeah, that's great. But I also don't think like that's the goal right now. I think it's like a really big lift. And so I think it's totally sufficient at this stage in the game to understand your customers and know when and why they would want to move back and forth and support those moves, and make it clear like when and how they can do it. You know, and that might just be at the end of every interaction. Like you just don't switch while you're in the middle of talking, and you know, you don't support keyboard interaction while there's an active voice interaction or something. But that's why context really matters with objective and things like that. And context, like if people are moving between rooms frequently, those are situations where you're probably going to want to be able to transition. And if you can't predict the timing, then that becomes a little bit more of a like, ooh, maybe we really do need to support arbitrary transitions. Or we'll support arbitrary transitions, but you're going to lose work or something like that. But I think like expecting it at any point in the journey, it is a big lift. I'm not gonna lie and like say like everybody should do it. It's easy. It's not. And you know, I think with the Echo Show, like you do the first voice interaction and then you can touch sometimes. And so there's a very distinct transition point. When I did design for Cortana, you know, you could type with her the whole time, or you could do a voice interaction with her and then you'd get the confirmation screen. You could either do a repeat voice interaction with her, or you could start a touch interaction. And so that was, you know, there was an inflection point there. But what we didn't allow is like touch to voice again. And you also see that in some car systems. Like once you've dropped, like you can start in voice, but once you drop down to touch is like touch city. That's where you live again. They live forever. I think the tough part about those like one-way transitions, it's hard to explain the why. You're going to get some frustration there, especially from people who are switching because they have to.
Yeah, Dan had a good note. Also implicates trust if you can move between devices in the middle of a sensitive task.
True. And like, yeah, they using like LED indicators to show that like right now you're currently locked into a device, or you're currently locked into a modality. Maybe that's one way to like subtly signify that like right now we can't do the switching thing. Or maybe it's something where like you use a tone to indicate when you can, like it is supported to cast between devices or something.
Alfredo, this question is after my own heart and is something I was trying to figure out how to ask. How can I bring focus to cultural considerations in terms of accessibility? I work within nonprofit, and at times accessibility is sacrificed. In terms of funding, our ability to bring in accessibility consultants with firsthand experiences to advocate is very limited, and I can only speak to its importance so much. How do you tackle these types of barriers when it feels like you are the only person advocating? He also says he really loves your book, and he's very excited to keep reading deeper.
Thank you for the question, Alfredo. And I wish I had like a silver bullet for this, because this one's a really tough one. I mean, the first step is to figure out who in the organization, like kind of like, you may have already done this, but like kind of do a stakeholder map for yourself and figure out like who's like skeptics and who's like potential allies. And then from there, start to do the storytelling work with the allies. Like if they're true allies, like they're already like sold on it, then that's a different conversation. That's like, hey, help me do the storytelling. But you know, there's this narrative gap between what exists and what you see we need, and we have to narrow that gap somehow. And the thing about it is, like, we've found, you know, I think you see it in some of the storytelling the foundation does, but like a lot of nonprofits, like specific storytelling helps like people. It's, you know, it's the whole thing where like horrible tragedies happen, you talk about like 500,000 people dying, and like people are numb, and then you talk about like one person having an issue, and it addresses us at a very specific level, because it's the way human brains work. And so if you can find ways to do storytelling where you're engaging the way human brains think, and you're like, okay, I'm going to tell individual stories of how our stakeholders or stakeholders like us or other companies like us have been affected by accessibility or have dealt with accessibility successfully, and it's made our mission more effective. Do those one-on-one kind of storytelling pieces to connect, instead of like saying like, we should do this, bring it down to that laser focus, so that hopefully it'll engage like the like human reptile brain more. Because it's, and you know, we did that sometimes too, we're like moving from storyboards to like, here are the videos of the actual people testing our stuff, because you needed, you know, when we were proving that we needed to spend the 6 million on the microphones, it's like, okay, here's the actual videos of the people saying that stuff, because you were very skeptical about it, so here are the actual conversations. So yeah, it's tough though. That would be my first step, is trying to connect individual stories. And it might be it might be your beneficiaries. It might be, you know, taking stuff from the Design Justice book or something, or other places, success stories from like the Xbox Adaptive Controller or something like that, and trying to take specific stories of people's benefit from these things and driving them home in some way.
He says, thank you. I think I have a lot of allies that are outside my team. I have to bring it in for the storytelling part. That is pretty darn close to a silver bullet. Thank you very much. And I also think there's some connections. Accessibility has some tie-ins with trauma-informed design and research, and cultural competency, and more of the cognitive and emotions that people are feeling as they're doing different actions. So I'm really excited to learn more about your approach to those areas as well. And let's see, I think Adam has another question. And this will be the last one, I think, if anyone else has anything else, sneak it in now. Are you investigating the use of app slicing or app clips to handle device transitions more easily?
I am not familiar with those technologies. So
Adam, do you want to?
Sure. I work for a company called Bottle Rocket that is like one of the big, we're like the first app developer, I guess. And we have been looking at app slicing and app clips. App clips is the name that iOS gives to these instances where you can get a notification that allows you to do something that would normally require you to download the app, but you don't have to.
Oh, interesting.
And so in the instance where maybe you start a task, let's say you start on a desktop, and a response isn't going to come to you right away, but later on a notification is going to come to you, so you're not in front of your laptop, so you get it on your phone. And there's a thing that you can do once you have that notification. So instead of having to have the app on your phone, you could just get the notification and do the thing you need to do without having to download anything or sign up for anything or anything like that.
I love that. I'm gonna have to look more into that deeply. And I love that it kind of removes an obstruction and makes that transition far less rocky. That's fascinating. Yeah. Like, I don't know if I'll ever have a version 2, but I'm sure I'll be talking about that if we get there.
Sure. Thanks.
That can be the next PDF that gets sent out if everyone buys your book. All right, well, thank you very much. I think that's a good amount of questions. Cheryl, you're a trooper. Thank you for sharing so much of your knowledge and your experience. Really learned a lot from you this evening.
Thank you all for joining. I hope it was helpful for you too. It was great to meet you all. Thank you for the great questions.
And thanks for being a trooper. Re the appendix.
Yes.
You made it.
No perfect time for anything.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Cal put our social links in the link tree, so make sure to follow up on those. Find us everywhere. We want to be friends with you everywhere to keep building and strengthening the UX community around here. And any parting thoughts from anyone?
Hope you can join us next month.
Yeah.
It was so nice to join. Once I'm in Dallas, and once we started moving the UX research and strategy meetups online, it became apparent there's no such thing as a local meetup anymore. So yeah, the light bulb came on. I started looking around for other meetups to go hang out in. So
Good. Glad you're here.
really enjoyed it.
Is there one in Dallas that we can crash?
Check out the UX research and strategy group.
Oh, cool.
It's run by 3 really neat friends of mine who do a magnificent job in terms of putting programs together, getting things set up months and months in advance. They have a big involvement with with World IA Day, and they hit lots of great topics, and they've been able to bring some really cool folks in, and I've been kind of a benefactor to help. I have no official role, but I help.
Great. Well, you'll probably see a New Hampshire contingent crashing that pretty soon.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much. And
Cheryl,
you got a lot of love in the chat, so I hope you're able to see some of that.
all right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. See you next month.